Hello, it's crime time, and today's crime is about David McGreavy, better known as the Monster of Worcester, who sent shockwaves through Britain in 1973 with a chilling act of brutality. Living as a lodger in a peaceful Worcester neighborhood, McGreavy committed a crime so heinous it defies comprehension. He brutally murdered 3 innocent children: 4-year-old Paul Ralph, 2-year-old Don Ralph, and 9-month-old Samantha Ralph. This is a chilling story of a man whose name would forever be synonymous with unspeakable horror. David Anthony McGreavy was born in Southport in 1951 to Bella and Thomas McGreavy. As the second eldest of 6 children, he showed no early signs of the notorious figure he would later become. Despite committing crimes as horrific as those by infamous child killers Ian Huntley and Raymond Morris, McGreavy's name and deeds remain largely unknown to the British public. Leading criminologist Professor David Wilson has delved into the early life of David McGreavy. With Tom McGreavy serving as a sergeant in the Royal Signals, the McGreavy's family life involved frequent relocations to different army bases. Analyzing his childhood for any ominous signs reveals a relatively normal upbringing. McGreavy attended army schools wherever his father was posted. According to Bella McGreavy, their time in Germany was the happiest for the family. The children enjoyed biking in the woods, skiing, and picnicking, relishing their family life together. Bella recounted one incident where young David caused concern. While living in Cardiff, he stole her shopping money to travel to Liverpool. This action suggested impulsivity, a longing for stability amid their nomadic lifestyle, and a desire to leave his family behind to explore elsewhere. In 1967, at the age of 15, David left school and pursued his childhood ambition by enlisting in the Royal Navy. By the late 1960s, he was stationed at Portsmouth Naval Base and joined his first ship, HMS Eagle. Dr. Elizabeth Yardley dug deep into David's wild ride in the Navy. Determined to join despite his dad's doubts, David's arrogance and troublemaking marked his naval days. At RNAS Brodie, he hit a low. Drunk and agitated, he broke into an officer's wardrobe and set a bin on fire, claiming it was an accident. The Navy wasn't buying it. He got court-martialed and acquitted of arson, but nailed for negligence and slapped with 90 days of detention. David underwent psych testing, though the results stayed hidden. His impulsive behavior hinted at deeper issues. By 1971, after a stint on HMS Eagle, he was shore-based at Portsmouth. There he exchanged letters with Mary, a friend's sister, and proposed after meeting her once. His mom disapproved due to Mary's severe health issues, but David, smitten, ignored her. By August 1971, his naval career abruptly ended. He returned home, defeated, with unclear reasons for his dismissal, possibly linked to his past antics. Civilian life hit him hard. He couldn't hold a job. He planned a Christmas wedding with Mary, but financial woes and his insistence on a big church ceremony led to Mary calling off the engagement on New Year's Eve. Mary wasn't into Marriott, always talking about her health worries. She knew it was way too soon to accept David's proposal and admitted she didn't share his intense feelings. David, though, was all in, no matter the obstacles. By 1972, David was back at his parents' place in Worcester, discharged from the Royal Navy, dumped by his fiancée, and jobless. The 20-year-old had lost everything. He was aimless, not contributing to household chores or rent, and not really job hunting. His parents eventually kicked him out. Enter the Ralphs. In 1972, David moved in with his buddy Clive Ralph, who lived with his wife Elsie and their 2 kids, Paul, 3, and Don, 20 months, in Worcester. Elsie was pregnant with their 3rd child. The Ralphs were a happy family, but their joy was about to be shattered. Clive and Elsie, childhood friends despite a 5-year age gap, shared an idyllic life in Leigh Sinton, Worcestershire, until April 13, 1973, when everything changed. Elsie fondly recalls their upbringing in the village as a happy time. They lived in a close-knit cul-de-sac with about 10 houses, where doors were always open, fostering a tight community where everyone looked out for each other. Dorothy Elsie Clay married Clive Ralph in September 1968 at 16, pregnant with their first child, Paul. Soon, Don joined the family in 1971. Clive worked hard in his family's lorry driving business, allowing them to settle on Gillam Street. Their family dynamic switched when David sought shelter with them. David showed up one day looking for a place to stay, Elsie recalls. Clive offered temporary accommodations that turned into a more permanent arrangement. By September 1972, Samantha arrived, making it a full house at number 8 Gillam Street. With 3 adults and 3 children in a 2-bedroom house, space was tight. David shared a room with Paul, Elsie remembers. Samantha slept in a cradle cot, and Don shared their bed. Despite Clive's frequent work trips, where David often helped out, Elsie saw him as a normal presence. He played with the children like any tall man would, she says. David paid rent and occasionally cooked Sunday dinners for the family, contributing to the household. Elsie painted David as your everyday bloke, working at a local factory and enjoying a pint or two with mates, just like any other guy back then. To most folks, David seemed all right, educated, and knew his manners, though a bit of a smarty pants who dropped by for a coffee now and then. No one suspected the darker side beneath his polished facade. As a lodger on Gillam Street, David's demeanor often flipped when he hit the bottle, unleashing arrogance and a prickly attitude. Worcester journalist Tony Bishop noted this Jekyll and Hyde routine. People found him pleasant enough, well-spoken, but that was his sober act. Around town, he was known at the local station and picked up a couple of times. There's that infamous incident where he's walking down the main road, tightrope walking the white line, thinking it proved he wasn't drunk. Except he really was. It got under Dad's skin. He lived nearby and told him to lay off the booze and stop job hopping, which kept him getting sacked. Meanwhile, Elsie took up bar work at the Punch Bowl in Ronkswood, leaving young Samantha in David's care, a decision they would soon regret. On that fateful night in April 1973, Elsie's world shattered as she recounted the tragic events. The children, tucked into bed and asleep, awaited their father's late-night return to pick up their mother from work. Elsie and Clive arrived home to a nightmare scene. The police already present, informing them of a murder and urging them to come to the station for further details. Elsie's memories blur with shock and grief. "I was hysterical," she recalled, her voice filled with pain. The overwhelming emotions led to a doctor administering an injection to help calm her. Though the details from the moment remain hazy, the realization sank in slowly. Her beloved children were gone, taken from her in a manner she couldn't yet comprehend. "They just said there was a murder," Elsie lamented, struggling to grasp the enormity of the tragedy. The specifics of what happened to Paul, Don, and Samantha were too devastating to fully comprehend in that moment of anguish and disbelief. On a seemingly ordinary evening, Paul, Don, and Samantha Ralph met a brutal end. But what led to such a horrific fate? It all started with David, who went to the Vauxhall pub with a friend. After downing 5 to 7 pints, they indulged in a few rounds of cards and darts. The atmosphere soured when a heavily intoxicated David extinguished a cigarette in his friend's drink, sparking a minor altercation. Clive Ralph, who had taken his wife to the pub, later collected David to babysit his children. At closing time, Clive returned to pick up his wife, but between 10:15 and 11:15 p.m., an enraged and drunken David unleashed a nightmarish attack on the Ralph children. Baby Samantha, crying for a bottle, was brutally murdered, suffering a compound skull fracture. Paul was strangled, and baby Don's throat was cut. The horror escalated as David mutilated their bodies with a pickaxe handle from the basement and displayed them on the railings outside the house. On Friday, April 13, 1973, the Ralph family's world was shattered. Their trusted lodger of a year, 21-year-old David, committed the ultimate betrayal with these unspeakable child murders. Elsie and Clive Ralph returned home to 8 Gillam Street in Worcester to a chilling scene. Police were already there, and their worst fears were confirmed. Their 3 children had been brutally murdered and left impaled on the garden railings. Shock and horror engulfed the neighborhood as the news spread. The police swiftly moved the Ralphs away from the scene, taking them to the station for questioning. They were not treated as suspects, but had to be interviewed to eliminate any possibility of their involvement. The community struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the tragedy that had befallen the Ralph family. Meanwhile, David, the lodger at Gillum Street and the only person unaccounted for, became the prime focus of the investigation. He was found by P.C. Elliott on Lansdowne Road around 3:50 a.m. and promptly arrested. His initial response upon arrest was bewildered. "What's this all about?" Journalists, including Tony Bishop and Paul Canute, covered the unfolding story with a mix of shock and disbelief. David initially denied the crime, but later confessed, albeit in a disjointed manner. He described putting his hand over one child's mouth, escalating to the brutal killings and the gruesome display on the garden railings. The motive remained elusive, with no clear reason offered for his actions. Despite suggestions from psychiatrists about possible motives, such as a potential sexual element, no evidence of prior abuse was found. David's actions that night were marked by varying methods of killing, suggesting a disturbing degree of premeditation rather than a sudden burst of rage. The community was haunted by questions that could never fully be answered. Witnesses recalled hearing unsettling sounds that night, adding to the grim atmosphere of the tragedy. Photographs of the Ralph family circulated, the only images left to remember them by. Ultimately, David McGreavy was charged with the murders of the 3 Ralph children. He was sentenced to life in prison at Worcester Crown Court, where he remained until his death in 2016. Mr. Justice Ashworth didn't miss words, laying down at least 20 years behind bars and emphasizing the chilling severity of David's actions and the looming threat of recurrence. Fast forward 40 years and David's attempts to fade into obscurity only reignited public fury. The horrors of that fateful day, Friday, April 13, 1973, when he snuffed out the lives of 3 innocent children, were far too monstrous to be forgotten. The brutality of his crime left scars not just on the victims' families, but on an entire community, sparking an unrelenting debate on whether his punishment was ever sufficient. The Ralph family's world was shattered, their lives irreparably fractured. David, now a pariah even among criminals, navigated a prison existence fraught with danger. The knowledge of his vile acts spread like wildfire, subjecting him to threats and violent attacks. His prison life was a volatile blend of seclusion and hostility, dictated by the ebb and flow of his fellow inmates' awareness of his crimes. By 2006, at 54 years old, David found himself temporarily housed in Ford Open Prison and a Liverpool bail hostel. The media frenzy that followed his relocation quickly forced him back into a high-security environment, highlighting the perpetual challenge of managing his notoriety and safety. Legal skirmishes over David's right to anonymity ensued, invoking the Human Rights Act in a bid to cloak his identity. Despite these efforts, the courts leaned increasingly towards transparency, culminating in the May 2013 decision to strip away his anonymity. The controversy over David's potential release is as fierce as ever. With over 40 years served, double the recommended minimum sentence, many argue that he remains a significant threat to society, particularly to children. The murky depths of his motives, coupled with the uncertainty of his remorse and rehabilitation, cast a long dark shadow over any consideration of his release. If you enjoyed this video, you might want to check out this one.